Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. Here, the museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of Army from the perspective of those who served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum: buy a book in our shop, including this book today, visit the cafe, donate, or become a member, where you can get exclusive discounts or your very own events program. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Richard Batten. Richard is an honorary research fellow at the University of Exeter. He has spoken on BBC Radio Devon and the Western Front Association's podcast about his research into Devon during the Great War. Today, Richard will be discussing the role of patriotism on the British home front in the First World War, the topic of his second book, For King and Country, the Role of Patriotism in the Mobilization in the First World War. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For online audience, post questions in the Q&A chat bar, and these will be put to our speaker at the end. Moving on to some technical points. If we have any technical issues, please bear with us whilst we work to rectify them. We suggest refreshing your browser solves most issues. A member of our team will always be active in the chat. With all that said, I'll now pass over to Richard. I hope you'll enjoy the talk. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and I'd like to say it's a great privilege here to be speaking at the National Army Museum about patriotism and its role on the home front of the First World War. I do need to warn people that one source I have used in this presentation does contain swearing. So, following the declaration of war on the 4th of August 1914, a great recruitment campaign was launched across the United Kingdom. Alongside the official recruitment campaign spearheaded by the Parliamentary Recruiting Committee, figures who were ineligible for military service sought to supplement official recruitment efforts. John Morton Osborne proposes that many older men and women viewed their involvement in such endeavours as a patriotic and visible substitute to military service. One older man who endeavoured to get eligible men to enlist was John Loosemore, a farmer from the North Devon village of Bishop's Nympton. As a man in his 60s, Loosemore could not enlist because of his age, but he was anxious about the defence of the nation. Loosemore's concerns meant that he held rather strong views about the duty of eligible men to take some part in military service, and believed that every military-age man who refused to defend his country was a coward. Motivated by a deep sense of patriotism, Loosemore never missed an opportunity to point out to other people what he thought was their duty. In the district surrounding the North Devon town of South Molton, Loosemore met and confronted many military-age men and farmers still at home, telling them they were cowards for not going off to fight. When Loosemore encountered one eligible man who was fishing by a river, he asked him whether he should be fishing while men were fighting, and called him a damned coward. At the local cattle market in November 1915, Loosemore challenged fellow farmer Robert Passmore Sr. and pointed out to him the duties of his sons. When Passmore Sr. revealed that his sons had decided to remain at home rather than enlist, he challenged Passmore Sr. and told him that basically they were contemptible cowards. However, Loosemore's behaviour of confronting and shaming military-age men still at home led to a violent confrontation on the 22nd of March 1916 with one of Passmore's sons, Robert Passmore Jr. On the 18th of April 1916, Loosemore summoned Passmore Jr. to appear at the Guildhall in the North Devon town of South Molton for assault. Under cross-examination by Passmore's solicitor, Michael John McGahey, Loosemore said that he felt justified in challenging eligible men who were not yet in khaki because it was his duty as an Englishman. However, McGahey responded that he was unconvinced that that was the frame of mind in which Loosemore had reproached many respectable farmers in the district. In his reply, Loosemore argued that these farmers were wanting in patriotism. After hearing Loosemore's answer, McGahey retorted, "Oh yes, you have got it all, and they have none. Because they choose to stay at home, exempted from military service by tribunals even, and work the land to produce foods, they are cowards. Is that your state of mind?" Loosemore answered that yes, it was in most cases, including this one. With this line of questioning, McGahey characterised Loosemore as a self-appointed arbiter of patriotism, because he knew what was patriotic and what was not. For every farmer and single man Loosemore encountered who decided to stay at home, he saw fit to reproach them, because he was appalled by their lack of patriotism. However, as McGahey pointed out, other farmers did not share Loosemore's strict views about patriotism. Indeed, Devon's farmers asserted that for every man on the farm to drop their tools and take up arms against the Germans in France or Belgium was not the only way in which they could show their patriotism. As a result, some people in Devon disagreed with the argument that patriotism was confined to the khaki suit. However, what role did patriotism play on the home front? This paper will reveal how army recruiters, civic dignitaries, newspaper columnists, and concerned citizens on the home front evoked and used patriotism in different contexts, and what these efforts reveal about the role of patriotism on the home front during the First World War. Maureen Healy describes that during the Great War, the involvement of civilians in various war-related activities in the home societies constituted a front, albeit a secondary one, that supported or complemented the military front. This secondary front in Britain and the belligerent nations has become known and identified as the home front. This spirit of civilians on the home front supporting the men on the fighting line is depicted in the figures represented in this poster. The man on the left is undertaking work in industry, whilst the two women are undertaking their duty in wartime roles with munitions work and nursing respectively. Even the scout plays a wartime role by delivering a parcel of what is presumably ammunition to the soldier. These figures are all lending a hand to help the war effort, except for the figure on the right. The finely dressed gentleman is doing the opposite by keeping his hands in his pockets. He is clearly represented as an unpatriotic figure, compared to the other civilians undertaking patriotic actions. This figure also touches upon the notion of a negative home front that had emerged in the minds of contemporaries. This negative home front was populated by unheroic male figures, such as shirkers, profiteers, and armchair patriots, who remained at home whilst other courageous men undertook their duty by serving in the military. Stephen Reynolds, the District Inspector of Fisheries for the South West and contemporary man of letters, evoked this negative home front in a letter to Henry Morris, a civil servant and fisheries secretary at the Board of Agriculture and Fisheries, in a letter on the 8th of December 1917. As District Inspector of Fisheries, Reynolds had had first-hand experience of the unending process of the Navy recruiting fishermen, and it had provided him with a continuing source of anxiety and criticism. In his letter to Morris, Reynolds alluded to the criticism he had endured from figures in Devon civil society, whom he labelled the provincial patriots. By carrying out the instructions of the government only too effectively, I have earned the enmity of the provincial patriots, whose patriotism, while they're on the safe side of military age, consists in superintending the patriotism of those who aren't exempt from military service. As a unique commentator with a distinctive journalistic sensibility, Reynolds' description of these local notables and their patriotic behaviour suggests that eligible men viewed these notable figures as armchair patriots. The reason for this was that since the provincial patriots were men above the age requirements for military service, between the ages of 18 and 41, as a result, they resided on the safe side of military age. Based on how he believed it was his patriotic duty to get eligible men to enlist and direct them to enlist, John Loosemore could be characterised as a provincial patriot. Indeed, his patriotism had consisted in superintending the patriotism of eligible men. However, patriotically minded women on the home front also acted as these superintendents of patriotism. The women volunteers of the White Feather Brigade, who presented the white feathers upon military-age men still in civilian clothes to indicate their cowardice, could be viewed in this light, since it was a very public and visible means to superintend their patriotism. Yet, as McGahey implied in his reply to Loosemore, patriotism was a contested term with different meanings. In a speech on patriotism in December 1914, Hugh Fortescue, the Lord Lieutenant of Devonshire, acknowledged that the term was not easy to define. Nevertheless, he advocated that the nearest and shortest definition of patriotism was a readiness to make a sacrifice of self on behalf of one's country and the greater interests which it involves. In a letter to the editor of the Devon Annexed Gazette, published on the 11th of December 1914, one farmer's son claimed that his family's farm had undertaken one such selfless act on behalf of the nation that demonstrated their patriotism. Although he loved his king and country, the farmer's son had decided against joining the army, after his father had told him that if he volunteered, he would have to sell the cows. Nevertheless, the farmer's son was determined to help the nation on the farm. He worked with his father to sow double the amount of wheat in the fields and decrease the acreage of oats on the farm by half. While growing more wheat helped domestic food supplies, it was less profitable than growing oats. Since the farm had taken this financial hit to grow food for the national interest, the farmer's son asked rhetorically, "Then are we not patriotic?" In the eyes of Devon's farmers, the importance of providing more food for the nation at this critical time contributed to the discourses of patriotism on the home front. Yet in his speeches and addresses at recruitment events, Earl Fortescue emphasised that it was the patriotic duty of the county's eligible men to enlist, because it was within his remit as Devon's Lord Lieutenant to promote voluntary recruitment and help secure recruits for the army and the territorials. One example of how Fortescue used the notion of patriotism was evident in his public address at Tiverton on the 1st of December 1914. After hearing that there were 5,000 single men and 4,000 married men in Devon's rural districts who had decided against volunteering, Fortescue wanted the audience to understand the consequences of these men's refusal. He had previously acknowledged in November 1914 that due to the county's low recruitment returns, Devon had nothing to be proud of in the matter of recruiting. The fact that these men had failed to come forward was thus a bad reflection upon Devon itself, because Fortescue suggested that other people's superior patriotism had to compensate for Devon's deficiencies. Fortescue later evoked patriotism on the 26th of February 1915, when he claimed that there were many places on a recent recruitment tour where the patriotism of young men began and ended with the wearing of a tricolour feather. He evoked this opposition of feathers, a white feather indicating a man's cowardice, and the other containing more patriotic colours, the red, white and blue of the British flag, to commend these men for enlisting and demonstrating their patriotism. In the context of voluntary recruitment efforts, Katrina Pennell has defined patriotism as a considered, reflective sense of obligation. In the eyes of his peers on the home front, the sight of eligible men, like the men pictured here in front of this recruitment office, deciding to enlist was a symbolic gesture worthy of praise, since they had fulfilled their obvious obligation as men to defend their country in a time of war. Contemporaries who were ineligible for military service sought to congratulate these men still further who volunteered, since they had made the right choice to fulfill their duty and present their patriotism in the correct way. These two recruitment posters present the notion of the older generation commending the younger generation for stepping up to the challenge. The poster on the left presents a Chelsea pensioner wishing farewell to the younger soldier going off to fight, whilst the poster on the right shows a military veteran congratulating a soldier who is following in presumably his father's footsteps, with the subtitle, "A Chip Off the Old Block." In Ottery St Mary, the congregation of the East Devon Town's Congressional Church wanted to commend their vicar, Reverend S.J.K. Mills, for volunteering by throwing him a farewell party. On the day of the party, the 3rd of December 1914, a senior deacon, W. Godfrey, presented to Mills a parting gift to commend him for his decision. The gift was to mark the noble, self-sacrificing patriotism underlying his decision to volunteer. Similar public displays of commendation to men who had volunteered for military service were evident in the Dorset coastal village of Charmouth. After the outbreak of war, a regular ceremony took place outside the local Coach and Horses Hotel, where the village band would play for every local man who had enlisted. Across the United Kingdom, counties like Cornwall and Devon had their own specific recruitment committees. As part of the recruitment campaigns that these committees spearheaded, civic dignitaries and army recruiters incorporated local identities in their appeals to encourage local men to enlist. Just as this recruitment poster incorporated visual imagery of London to appeal to the men of the city to enlist, recruitment efforts in Exeter incorporated Exeter's Latin motto of semper fidelis, translated to always faithful or always loyal. The motto was featured in a recruitment campaign to raise a PALS battalion known as Exeter Zone for Kitchener's new army. Since Exeter Zone would be a company of chums, comprising men from the city, the proposed unit would naturally appeal to the loyalty and patriotism of ever-faithful citizens. A correspondent for the Devon and Exeter Gazette argued that the eligible men in the city needed to realise that the battalion was also a reflection of Exeter's patriotism. As a result, they needed to rise to the challenge and prove their patriotism and that of their home city. The true test of patriotism is to fight for king and country in the hour of need. The test of Exeter patriotism is to join Exeter's own company of the 11th Battalion of a regiment which, under the encomium, good old Devons, has won fresh laurels of imperishable glory on the famous battlefields of France and Flanders. To encourage the men of the East Devon town of Topsham to pass their own test of patriotism, Earl Fortescue turned to local history as a recruitment strategy. He evoked the contribution that the town had made in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. With this noble historical precedent in mind, Fortescue believed that the men of the town would be inspired to undertake their duty to defend the nation. Indeed, he expressed his confidence that the patriotism of these men was as strong in 1914 as it had been among their Elizabethan forebears. To encourage men of fighting age still on the home front to enlist, newspaper columnists and figures from civil society championed individuals who represented examples of patriotism to emulate in a campaign of patriotic commendation. On the 23rd of November 1914, Earl Fortescue drew attention to one such family from the North Devon town of Barnstaple, who had sent 6 brothers to join the colours. Later, on the 20th of April 1915, Army recruiter Lieutenant Larden commended a family in the in the Dartmoor village of South Seal, who had 6 sons serving. Larden believed that the family was setting an excellent example of true patriotism. Whilst Army recruiters sought to promote these families as patriotic examples to inspire other men to follow, they also used these examples to shame families whose sons had not volunteered. The contrast between demonstrating true patriotism and its opposite is evident in this recruitment poster here on the screen, encouraging military-age men who remained in the crowd not to stay there and watch the soldiers go past. On the 2nd of January 1915, the Devon and Exeter Gazette sought to stress to eligible men like these men in the crowd that they were not acting the role of true patriots. No man was a true patriot, the paper argued, if he points to thousands of men in khaki around him and remarks, "There seems to be enough for the time being. I shall leave it until I'm wanted." In the North Devon town of Linton, the vicar of the parish church, Reverend T.N. Mumford, imparted a similar criticism against eligible men who remain bystanders rather than enlist. In his sermon on patriotism, Mumford argued that true patriots were those who volunteered for service and not those who enthusiastically cheered them. The former Liberal MP for the city of Plymouth, Thomas Dobson, also spoke in similar terms when he expressed his frustrations against farmers who were not yet in khaki. In light of the urgent need for recruits, Dobson argued that the local farmers still at home were not acting the part of true patriots. Newspaper columnist Harold Ashton was also unconvinced that Devon's farmers acted as true patriots. In an article published in September 1916 in the Daily Mail, Ashton suggested that many Devon farmers were guided primarily by their wallets and not loyalty to the nation. As a result, Ashton claimed that they operated under the war cry of purse before patriotism. Just as you had true patriotism and its opposite, you had instances of patriotic and unpatriotic behaviour. On the home front, contemporaries labelled activities or forms of behaviour that they deemed inappropriate or counterproductive in a time of war as unpatriotic. The poster on the screen is an example of this, as it presents the message that in this time of war, it is now considered unpatriotic to dress extravagantly. Football was a leisure activity that many contemporaries considered unpatriotic, since it held many military-age men back from undertaking their duty. The fact that Exeter City Football Club had decided to continue playing football after the outbreak of war created controversy. F.T. Colclough, a resident of the East Devon seaside town of Sidmouth, was bewildered that the citizens of Exeter would allow football to be played in the city in wartime. In a letter published in the Devon and Exeter Gazette, Colclough argued that it was a shame that some young men from the city could not be sent to Canada or any of the other colonies of the British Empire to reassess their priorities and learn what true loyalty and patriotism mean. In the face of attacks from the press and concerned citizens, the secretary of Exeter City Football Club, Sidney Thomas, tried to counter them in a letter published in the Devon and Exeter Gazette on the 4th of September 1914. Although football games attracted large crowds, including many military-age men, Thomas stressed that cancelling football as a wartime measure would not spur these men to enlist. However, in an addendum to the letter, the newspaper's editor thought fit to clarify Thomas's justification, since it did not weaken the arguments, in his view, against football from the standpoints of patriotism and decency. 2 days later, the Devon and Exeter Gazette published this cartoon that portrayed football as an unpatriotic activity to coincide with a momentous football match between Exeter City and West Ham. Titled "Rifle or Football Which?", this illustration depicts two figures. On the right is an Exeter City football player holding a leather football, and on the left is Lady Britannia wearing a band decorated with the word of patriotism. Lady Britannia is holding the football player back from continuing the game. She is staring at him disapprovingly and presents him with a rifle. By thrusting a gun towards the man of military age and the footballer, Lady Britannia directed the man to accept the right patriotic course of action as a man of military age. Her gesture also carried greater authority since she is presented here as an arbiter of patriotism, the nation's guardian wearing the ribbon of patriotism. When adjudicating on court cases on the home front, magistrates included value judgments about the defendant's behaviour and whether it demonstrated a lack of patriotism. One example of this involved Mary Ellen Briggs, a resident of the Warwickshire town of Atherstone. Briggs had firmly objected to seeing a recruitment poster displayed opposite her breakfast room window. Although a local man had gained permission to put the poster up, Briggs detested the sight of it, and she took matters into her own hands. On the 31st of August 1914, armed with a knife, flannel, and a bucket of water, she stripped the recruitment poster off the wall. When she was summoned to appear before the local magistrates at Atherstone Police Court on the 29th of September to justify her actions, Briggs explained that she removed the print because it was the most unsightly poster in the town. However, the chairman argued that she had behaved very foolishly and she had committed a most unpatriotic act. In response, Briggs refuted this and argued that her loyalty was not in any doubt, claiming that she was as loyal as anyone. The chairman disagreed and replied that by removing the recruitment poster, she had demonstrated otherwise. Albert Call was another individual who magistrates had to consider on the 29th of September 1914 for his behaviour after he had decided to heckle and disparage speakers at a recruitment meeting in the Dartmoor town of Bovey Tracy 10 days earlier. Every time the Germans were mentioned by the speakers, he had deemed it important to shout, "Sod them! Why don't you go yourself?" Although Call claimed in front of the magistrate he had only sworn against the Germans, the fact that he shouted the words, "Why don't you go yourself?" reveals that Call sought to undermine the appeals of army recruiters. When examining the case, the chairman of Newton Abbot Petty Sessions concluded that Call's appalling behaviour was most unpatriotic and offensive. In the coverage of Call's trial, the Devon and Exeter Gazette agreed with the chairman's judgment in that Call's behaviour was not patriotic conduct. With the introduction of conscription in 1916, contemporaries hoped that military-age men who had decided against volunteering would no longer be able to avoid military service. Just as this daily sketch front page indicates, the slackers would now have to follow the male citizens who had undertaken their duty by enlisting voluntarily. However, if a man of fighting age did not want to be conscripted, he could submit an application against it. A vast network of local military service tribunals across England, Wales and Scotland arbitrated upon these applications. These bodies included local public dignitaries who determined whether the man in question could gain exemption. If the man or his employer were unsatisfied with the local tribunal's decision, they could appeal against it. At the same time, the military possessed the right to appeal exemptions granted by local tribunals. In Devon, the Devon Appeal Tribunal reviewed these appeals. When reviewing an individual's application for exemption against conscription, some figures on the Devon Appeal Tribunal used the behaviour of the applicants or their employers to make value judgments about their patriotism or lack thereof. One incident that formed the basis for tribunalists to make a value judgment about patriotism was during the appeal of unattested cattleman Preston Pugsley on the 12th of July 1916. Although the Devon Appeal Tribunal had granted Preston a final extension until the 1st of September, this result did not satisfy William Pugsley, Preston's father and employer. If the result were final, William declared, then he would have no choice but to sell his livestock. Offended by William's self-centred response, Lieutenant Stirling, the tribunal's military representative, asserted that the Pugsleys did not seem to care about the war and were only concerned about their cattle. As a result, Stirling concluded that there did not seem to be a pennyworth of patriotism going. Later, Lieutenant Stirling suggested there was a lack of patriotism on the 5th of July 1917, when the Devon Appeal Tribunal reviewed the exemption of wheelwright Frederick Thomas Way. Despite the tribunal deciding to uphold the military's appeal, J.M. Mefferell, the tribunal's representative for the Board of Agriculture and Fisheries, declared the army should not take men like men away, as they were essential in supporting farmers to plough the 3 million additional acres required for food production. Mefferell's remarks prompted someone in the court to applause. This reaction caused Lieutenant Stirling to argue that it was shameful that some men and people in North Devon still did not understand the need for men for the army. He snapped back. "That's a very popular decision in North Devon. It's far away from the firing line. I think when a man who should be doing his duty is at home, the person who claps is not a patriotic citizen. When words are spoken to the effect that young men should be left at home, they are clapped." After hearing Stirling's response, Mefferell countered that North Devon was as patriotic as any other part of the country. However, Lieutenant Stirling scolded Mefferell further by arguing that he should associate himself with the lieutenant's remarks and asked people who came to tribunals not to clap. Just as many older men and women viewed their involvement in recruitment endeavours as a patriotic substitute to military service, ineligible figures saw their involvement in charities and wartime philanthropy as an equally valid way to present their patriotism. For women on the home front, knitting garments for soldiers and sailors was an appropriate means to demonstrate their commitment to the war and a symbolic way to claim citizenship in the wartime community. The North Devon Journal highlighted the work of a 16-year-old girl in Barnstable who had knitted 8 pairs of socks and 2 pairs of kneecaps in her spare time. With one exception, she had paid for the material to make these goods and the transport of the material out of her own finances. In light of her achievement, the paper suggested that the girl's efforts were an example of patriotism worthy of the highest commendation. Like knitting, the duty of providing maternal care represented a distinct and appropriate contribution that women could exclusively make to the war effort. This feminine mobilisation was evident in Exeter with the Mayoress of Exeter's War Depot. In October 1914, Mrs. Nellie S. King, the Mayoress of Exeter at the time, had gained permission from Lord Kitchener to be informed by telegraph of the arrival of troop trains into Exeter. When the trains stopped at Exeter's railway stations, Mrs. King and other volunteers from her depot were stationed on the platform and provided these soldiers with lunchboxes, tea, coffee, cigarettes, and other foodstuffs. These items of hospitality were either donations from the general public or bought with funds contributed to the War Depot. When Mrs. Janie Kirk Owen became the Mayoress of Exeter in November 1914, she continued the work of the War Depot to provide this hospitality. By December 1914, the depot's volunteers had handed out 11,564 lunchboxes to soldiers arriving at Exeter's railway stations. Devon's newspapers praised the efforts of the Mayoress of Exeter and our other women volunteers to provide hospitality to British soldiers and those from across the British Empire, like the Australian soldiers presented in this photograph, with the Mayoress of Exeter in the middle. Accompanying the gifts given to the soldiers who stopped at Exeter was a little card conveying the good wishes of the Mayoress of Exeter and her committee, printed with the coat of arms of the city and Exeter's Latin motto. Here on the screen is one such card dated the 18th of May 1916, where a soldier from the 3rd East Surrey Regiment has recorded that they received 50 meals with coffee at 9p each, roughly £2.21 in today's money. The activities of the Mayoress of Exeter and her helpers to bestow humanitarian administrations to soldiers at Exeter's railway stations were viewed as a modest extension of the care women provided to sons and husbands in the household. Indeed, one mother from Leeds, whose son benefited from the depot's hospitality fund, thanked the Mayoress of Exeter for mothering her son in her place. The Western Morning News later suggested that the hospitality provided by the Mayoress of Exeter and her women volunteers to the troops passing through the city had given Exeter a worldwide reputation. In rural communities on the home front, many people believed that donating eggs to the war effort was an appropriate way to demonstrate their patriotism. The organisation that collected donations of eggs was the National Egg Collection for the Wounded, and this organisation sought to deliver newly laid eggs to wounded soldiers and sailors in base hospitals or collect funds to do so. On the right of the screen is a card from the National Egg Collection thanking Miss Connor from the North Devon village of Kings Nimpton for the 285 eggs she had sent to the organisation by September 1915. Later in December 1915, the Bideford Farmers Union depot of the National Egg Collection announced that it had sent a total of 15,750 eggs from the district. Donating an egg or eggs to the National Egg Collection was a popular activity for many people, including farmers, since it was a practical way to support the war. Since it was such a pragmatic and sensible way to support the war, a correspondent for the South Devon Weekly Express proposed that the people of South Devon would never be so unpatriotic as to refuse to donate their eggs. To people on the home front, the contribution of eggs to the war effort was a highly symbolic gesture. By writing messages, painting pictures, and penciling their name and address onto these items, they became tokens of communication, as important as letters and postcards. Accordingly, these donated eggs represented an emotional mutual connection between loved ones serving overseas, in the military, or anonymous individuals. Many citizens on the home front were also keen to support the war effort through war loans, war bonds, and war savings certificates. Alongside advertising their appeal as financial investments, the campaigns to promote these forms of economic mobilisation on the home front encouraged civilians to invest on the basis of demonstrating their patriotism. In Exeter, the Mayor of Exeter, James Owen, promoted the merits of the Third War Loan, also known as the 5% War Loan. On the last day of fundraising for the loan, the 16th of February 1917, Owen dispatched an appeal to the city citizens to lend money to the war loan. Do not be compelled. Be a patriot. Come forward freely. In total, Exeter subscribed around £1.25 million towards the Third War Loan. 10 days earlier, the chairman of Ottery St Mary Urban District Council also utilised patriotism in his appeal for this war loan. What was wanted was for each individual to show patriotism. Every penny that could be got was wanted to be put into this loan. Later in December 1917, the citizens of Exeter were encouraged to, during the Tank Week, to invest in war bonds or war savings certificates on the basis of demonstrating their patriotism. Like other towns and cities across the United Kingdom, Exeter sought to raise money for the war effort by utilising a model tank as a centrepiece for this fundraising campaign. The Tank Week in Exeter was a great success, since a total of £40,400 was raised by the citizens of the city. Following the introduction of conscription, the campaign to substitute male labour with women in agriculture became a more urgent priority. In Devon, prominent women from the county civil society promoted the merits of female labour in farming within the discourses of patriotism. Miss Mary Sylvia Camaldee-Hamelin presented the women's war work movement in the county as a vital means to restore Devon's patriotic reputation in light of the county's low recruitment returns. Since a slur had been cast on the patriotism of some parts of Devonshire, Camaldee-Hamelin argued that it rested upon the county's women to save the fair name of Devonshire. The sight of women undertaking agricultural work would provide a more substantial basis upon which they could appeal to Devon's working class women to work the land. Later in December, the chairman of the Devon Farmers Union, William Tremlett, also suggested that the example of educated women undertaking work on the land would in time stimulate the patriotism of others. After overseas food supplies were hampered when unrestricted submarine warfare was restarted in 1917, the need to produce more food at home gained greater importance. The imperative to transform land for food production was also evoked in the discourses of patriotism. A correspondent for the Central Somerset Gazette on the 5th of April 1918 evoked patriotism in an article entitled "Patriotism and Potatoes." It is unpatriotic for every person who possesses the smallest amount of spare time not to devote that time to the cultivation of potatoes. It is not sufficient in these strenuous and self-sacrificing days to voice one's patriotism in theory. To be true patriotism, it must be carried into practical effect. Yet not all people on the home front complied with this imperative to grow food on their land. On the 20th of April 1917, the Western Morning News printed an anonymous letter signed under the initial S. The author complained about the construction of a pleasure garden and a new tennis court in the West Devon town of Oakhampton. The letter argued that the people who had built the pleasure garden and tennis court were unpatriotic and selfish because they had squandered the land's potential, whilst other patriotically minded people had dug up their gardens to grow food. Mrs. Simmons, a resident of Totnes, proposed to grow food in an unusual choice of land to help with the dire situation regarding potatoes in the spring of 1917. She advocated that potatoes should be grown in unused plots of consecrated ground in the cemetery of the South Devon town. Although Totnes Town Council and the local government board supported her proposal to till the consecrated ground for this purpose, the Diocese of Exeter held firm objections. However, Mrs. Simmons did not give up, and she wrote to the Bishop of Exeter, Lord William Cecil, asking him to reconsider. In his reply, Cecil reluctantly conceded to the request, making the exception on the basis that David ate shrew-bread. Moreover, he emphasised that the food grown in these plots must be given away to the poor. Conclusions. The question presented earlier in this talk was, what role did patriotism play on the home front? Patriotism played a significant role on the home front because it acted as an inducement to encourage civilians to make the right moral choice. Indeed, evidence from Devon reinforces the argument that a patriot was an individual who made the right moral choice. It was through one's actions that one demonstrated their patriotism. The Western Times proposed that this was the case when the tabloid suggested on the 19th of October 1915 that true patriotism consists in actions, good and wisely considered. The columnist for the Central Somerset Gazette put forward a similar statement when he suggested that it is not sufficient in these strenuous and self-sacrificing days to voice one's patriotism in theory. To be true patriotism, it must be carried into practical effect. Most civilians presented in this poster are examples of patriotism because they had made the right moral choice and supported the war effort through their actions. Figures from Devon's local elite commended fighting-age men for volunteering because they had made the right moral choice and presented their patriotism correctly by enlisting in the army. Contemporaries also championed men who volunteered or families with more than one son who had joined up as patriotic examples, since these men had fulfilled their true patriotic duty in wartime to fight for their king and country. Fortescue used the patriotic example of the men from Topsham's past to inspire their descendants in 1914 to prove their own patriotism and enlist. Civilians on the home front were encouraged to prove their patriotism by donating money to war-related investments and donating eggs to the war effort. However, civic figures, newspaper columnists, and concerned citizens highlighted individuals on the home front who made unpatriotic choices. One concerned citizen wanted to publicly shame those who had made unpatriotic choices in how they used land, not to grow food for the nation, but for selfish and frivolous pursuits. Magistrates arbitrated upon the conduct of individuals like Mary Ellen Briggs and Albert Call and deemed it unpatriotic. After an individual applauded Mefferell's defence of keeping men back at home to help with food production, Lieutenant Sterling denounced this individual as not a patriotic citizen. Newspaper columnists and civic figures arbitrated upon these instances of patriotic or unpatriotic behaviour. They utilised this dichotomy between patriotic and unpatriotic examples, thereby contributing to the discourses of patriotism on the home front. Although Stephen Reynolds suggested these local notables superintended patriotism, civic figures believed it was their duty to provide leadership in wartime. Notables such as Earl Fortescue and James Owen saw their wartime activities as a campaign to educate Devon's population and encourage them to participate in mobilisation efforts. They attempted to stimulate this patriotism by using patriotic examples which they hoped would inspire others to emulate. Yet, as a unique observer, Reynolds noticed that eligible men did feel that other people were superintending their patriotism. Figures like John Loosemore had taken it upon themselves to judge and police people's choices in wartime. The validity of these choices was rooted in the socially and morally acceptable codes of conduct in wartime, what was perceived as reasonable or unreasonable, acceptable or unacceptable. By using the social morality of wartime, figures on the home front encouraged men of fighting age and civilians to re-evaluate their priorities, to put the national interest before self-interest, patriotism before profit. John Loosemore saw himself as an arbiter of patriotism where he had tried to get local men of fighting age still at home to reconsider their priorities. Similar enthusiasm was evident among the female volunteers of the White Feather Brigade, who had tried to get men still in civilian clothes to reassess their priorities by giving them white feathers. The illustration of Lady Britannia as an arbiter of patriotism was a stark message about reviewing priorities in wartime, since she directed the man of military age playing football to accept the right patriotic course of action and enlist. Yet the ways in which civic figures, army recruiters, newspaper columnists, and concerned citizens evoked and used patriotism reveals a lot about the role it played on the home front. People in Devon had differing views about patriotism, and many parties contested it. Civic figures in Devon attempted to promote and control their definition of what patriotism was for military-age men. Most of Devon's farmers believed that producing food was the best way to present their patriotism. Although this was a valid form of patriotism, Devon's notable figures thought the county's farmers could better serve the nation by giving it men than by giving it meat. However, patriotism was not restricted to the khaki suit, as civilians on the home front demonstrated their patriotism through wartime philanthropy. This humanitarian patriotism was evident in knitting items for combatants and donating eggs to the war effort. Based on how the population of Cornwall responded to the war beyond recruitment efforts, Stuart Daly contends that Cornwall's patriotism was arguably of a more humanitarian variety. In many instances, the patriotism of many people in Devon was more humanitarian than militaristic. One high-profile example of Devon's humanitarian patriotism was the hospitality given to troops at Exeter's railway stations by the Mayoress of Exeter and her team of lady helpers. The city's civic dignitaries and local newspapers championed their efforts as one example where these women had proven their patriotism by fulfilling their duty to support the men fighting on their behalf. Just as civic figures identified individuals who had shown through their behaviour that they were not patriotic citizens, they possessed the same enthusiasm to promote individuals who had, through their actions, proven themselves to be patriots on the home front. Thank you very much.